Sir. Hello, good evening. Welcome to everybody here and on Zoom. On behalf of the Center for Spiritual Deepening, I'd like to welcome LJ back for the third exciting installment of John Scotus Eriugena. Ready to go.
Thank you so much. Yes, welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. No. Let's start with John Scotus Eriugena's method for contemplation. If you have your sheet that I handed out to you, that I prepared for you, it's our opening prayer, but I invite you just to put it aside and let me read it to you. And if you can, clear your laps and put your feet on the floor and rest your hands in your lap. And take a big, deep breath. And just listen to John Scotus Eriugena leading us into silence. Abandon the operations of your intellect, together with everything that is and is not. And so enter the state of not knowing. Be restored to unity with the nothing, who is above every essence and understanding. Wholly detached from thoughts, unknow the divine goodness, the absolute nothingness, who is the essence of the whole universe. And now just take a few moments to be in silence, to be in God without thinking. If you find you're getting distracted or caught up in your thinking, return your attention to your breath. And take a big, deep breath. And when you're ready, open your eyes. All right, so we've been talking about John Scotus Eriugena, that 9th century Irish scholar, and we might say mystic if we don't think of a mystic as someone who has visions and ecstasies and extraordinary experiences, but rather as someone who sees reality, then he's a mystic. I don't know if you remember, but last year we talked about Anthony DeMello when I was with you guys over Zoom. And he had a way of putting it: we don't see reality as it is, we see reality as we are. And that is a good summary of what John Scotus Eriugena is talking about with our knowing and the obstacles to pure knowing. Recall that his major theme, as I've been putting it, and this is from probably the third book, the Paraphusion, his major work on nature, on the division of nature, is divided into 5 books. And in the third book, he's talking about God as goodness and as nothingness. And that's where I get this line: the divine goodness regarded as above all things is said not to be and to be absolutely nothing. It is the essence of the whole universe. So there's a great deal of paradox in that statement, in that theme of his. And if you recall, John Scotus Eriugena is a Neoplatonic philosopher, and that means that he has the general understanding that comes from Plato but travels through Plotinus, who was a philosopher in the, I believe, the 200s in Alexandria, oddly enough, Egypt. But the schema he adopts from Neoplatonism that he gets from Plato and Plotinus, but also Augustine, and that has long-lasting effects down through the ages in the church, is that everything comes from God and returns to God. And reality is like a circle, right? And at the top of the circle is God, and everything comes out of God and everything goes back to God. That's just the way things go. It's called the exitus. Everything is exiting from God, and the reditus, the return. Everything goes back into God. So a lot of the Parousia is about the return journey. He spends a number of basically books 1 through 3 talking about the exitus, and he does a lot of philosophical exegesis on the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is probably one of his primary scriptural references throughout the whole of his work. But he gives to us along the way, books 1 through 5, tastes of the return. I talked a little bit about last week, abandoning the operations of your intellect, being detached from thoughts. I also have lifted, and this is also in your handout. It starts on the first page and goes to the next page. Another description of the individual soul's way of returning, or the way that you and I can unleash our consciousness. You might remember the first session we talked about Eriugena's project is to not just give you a philosophical work to read, something to think about and study. His goal is to unleash your consciousness, because it is leashed by a lot of different over-identifications, a lot of different feelings and thinking and patterns of thought, habits of emotion and mentation, you might say. So he gives us a number of descriptions of the way that individuals can return to the divine unity and be, as he says, be restored to unity with the divine nothing. So, and this was a harsh one, it might sound like, but recall he's living in the 800s and he was likely formed in a monastery in Ireland. And again, it's the 800s. It's going to be a little harsh. And he's very formed by Greek philosophy, and they did not have a positive view of the body. So it's actually remarkable that he got as positive a view of the body as he did, and still had so much appreciation for Greek philosophy that had almost no, at least what he was reading, didn't appear to have much appreciation for the body. So let's just go through this, because this is an important selection from the Parousia, and it's an important one to understand. And you can read it, and you can read it wrongly. So it starts again on that first page and goes into the next page. So I'm just going to read it, and if you want, follow along or just listen. For whoever lives perfectly not only utterly despises his body and the life by which it is administered, and all the corporeal senses along with the things which he apprehends through them, and all the irrational motions which he perceives in himself, along with the memory of all changeable things. He even crushes and destroys them insofar as he can, lest they prevail in him in any way. He strives wholly to die to them and to have them die to him. But insofar as he participates in celestial essence, he renews himself from day to day, i.e., from virtue to virtue, with divine grace moving him, working with him, guiding him, and bringing fulfillment. The nature shared by man with animals is called flesh, but that which participates in celestial essence is mind or intellect. All right, let's look at the key words that make this such a hard paragraph to read. Despises, I have these underlined and italicized for you and bolded. Crushes and destroys, and dying. Now, he's obviously getting the bulk of this not only from Greek philosophy, but from Jesus' teaching on death to self, denying self, losing your life. But he is not necessarily meaning that we hate human flesh, that we literally hate material creation. Because in so many other parts of the Parousia, he's elevating material creation. The key, I think, is if you go to the last line, okay? The last two lines. The nature shared by man with animals is called flesh, but that which participates in celestial essence, that's God. But that's God not as creative and personal, that's God as beyond all things and the inner reality of all things. That which participates in celestial essence is mind or intellect. So he wants, in other words, and this is a classic distinction I think we need to make with almost every mystic. They want you to detach from the things you consider all important. They're not concerned, if you love your dog. I hope if you have dogs, I hope you love your dog. I've wanted, recently, this past few years, I've wanted a bloodhound. I don't know why. I just would love to have a bloodhound. I would love that bloodhound. I'd probably name him something like from the Desert Fathers, like a Vagrius or something. But God, I love that. I would love to have a bloodhound. And I'm sure he would love me, right? But it's different if I'm treating, let's call him a Vagrius. if I'm treating Vagrius as an absolute, I'm actually putting more pressure on a Vagrius, my fictional bloodhound, if I make him absolute. And we do the same, of course, with our families and friends. We can't expect them to fulfill us forever. That's God's job, right? We can't expect even the good things of life, right? And then when we turn the good things of life into attachments, or as the Bible calls them, idols, that's when misery sets in. That's really when sin sets in. So hear that behind this passage. And his concern in that last line is he wants you to, again, unleash your mind, your consciousness, your intellect. Those are all basically synonyms here. Okay, so in other words, here instead of despise, here let go. Let go of your attachment to the body, the life by which it's administered, the senses, the things which your senses apprehend, all the irrational emotions you feel in yourself, along with the memory of all changeable things. Because there is a way to enjoy all of those different parts of being human without being trapped by them. And I think that's his concern, is that we can get trapped, even if you just take memory. One of the priests I used to work for, and it's like, he was from Canada, and it's like, apparently in Canada, they were always like 10 years behind the United States. So in the 1960s, it really felt like the 1950s. So when we were going through like the sexual revolution, they were still, Ward and Beaver. And he just was perpetually talking about growing up in Canada in the 60s. And it's like, it's not 1965 anymore, Father. It's actually like 2013. Whenever I was working for him, like it's not time to go back. We can't live there anymore. Okay, you can't long for that past because it's dead. It's gone. I'm sorry. Don't mean to hate to break it to you, but it's dead and gone. But if we keep living in the past, living in nostalgia, right? Nostalgia is a weird, irrational movement, according to Eriugena, because it can help us to live more connected in the present, especially if you see someone who's an old friend, if you have a connecting point, it can pull you into the moment with them. But it can quickly kind of go overboard, can it? And you're just living in the past. We can equally live the future. Just on my way here, I was thinking about my bills and I was not happy. So it's what's going to happen? There's just tons of things coming down the pike in the future. You could think about, God, what's that cloud in Ohio? What's that going to do with the derailing of that train? How's that town going to survive? I mean, and those are legitimate questions, by the way, but we can get caught up in those questions so easily, right? So it's really about, for Eriugena, crushing and destroying. He's trying to emphasize, you've got to let that go. You've got to let go of these traps. It's almost like the mind is a series of well-laid traps for us. And we just kind of get lost down its labyrinthine alleys, just literally lost in thought, right? Lost in feelings. And then that dictates how we act, right? We usually act out of a particular mind. And if our mind is preoccupied with some hurt in the past, that's going to affect our present. If our mind is preoccupied with some worry in the future, that's going to also affect our present and affect the present moment negatively. So he's not saying live in the moment, but he is kind of saying live in the moment. We crush and destroy and die to and despise all these movements of the body, which again, it's Neoplatonism, it's being a little extreme, it's the early Middle Ages, and he is trying to get across, let go. But we do all that by participating in essence. And that is the really key thing, and makes you realize he's actually being quite positive here. So it's not about hating on the body or hating and putting down and shaming material creation in any way. It's instead bring your mind into alignment with essence. And let's go back to the on the first page, the two Latin phrases, which could be kind of shorthand for his whole theology, his whole mystical theology. Omnino nihil, essentia omnium. Notice all is in both of those words. Omnino really means absolute, but it's a kind of version of all. And then omnium is the all. The essence of all, God is the essence of all, and God is the absolutely nothing. We know that reality. We don't know about that reality. I'm telling you about it with words, right? And study is certainly a part of his practice, but he wants you to know reality. And the paradox here is you know reality by unknowing, by unknowing all these things he lists, whether it's your body, your life, the life administered by your body, everything that your senses apprehend, all the irrational motions within you, and everything through your memory, basically anything that's going on between your ears. He says that is what you unknow. And a state of unknowing is where he wants you to live. That state in which we're not attached to our thinking, because you still have to think, I would presume. But you know, the funny thing is if we're not only to believe Eriugena, but also, you know, Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, the Cloud of Unknowing, the Desert Fathers and Mothers, Eckhart Tolle, most recently, right? If we're to believe all of them, we don't need to think as much as we think we do. We can get by without a whole lot of thinking and only use it when we need it, as much as you might use, you know, your vacuum cleaner when you need it. Now, I use my vacuum cleaner like several times a day because I have 3-year-old twins. But there might be other days I don't use it at all, right? So it's Eriugena saying, I want you to live in this state. Yes, use your mind in terms of thinking and reason, but the more important and the more basic and the more liberative dimension is to let go of everything. Let your mind experience pure consciousness. And then it's really unleashed. It's not bound to anything. Because that's really what he's talking about in this quote, about the different things that bind us in the sense, again, of trapping us. Now, Eriugena was very concerned again about all of this liberation. Here's my sheet. But he never, and you might think, this is a Christian, right? He actually never forgets Jesus Christ. For him, the Christ, Jesus the Christ, is the non-dual unity of flesh and spirit, of flesh and mind, capital M. Eriugena sees all of reality as the infinite, transcendent, unknown God proceeding from the divine darkness or nothingness into the light of being, speaking the word who is Christ. So Christ is the light of being that is also the divine nothing. Jesus reveals that to us, and in good Irish fashion, he understands Jesus as something like the memory, our great reminder of who we are and of who God is. So Jesus Christ is this unity of creation with the divine goodness, the divine nothingness. And knowing this unity, and again, I don't mean knowing about it, I don't mean knowing it like you would know an object. I mean, this unity that Jesus is that knowing. That's the knowing you enter into in that state of unknowing, when you're letting go of your thinking and when you're just resting in God's presence. That is, for Eriugena, the unity of the material and the spiritual. That is Christ. In that moment, this isn't heresy, I don't think. Every time I talk about Eriugena, it's like, this isn't heresy, right? No, this isn't heresy. But really, every time you're in that state of mind, even if you're just there for a second, like we were just when we started, you are Christ. That's the Christ. And that's Christ realized, because for him, you're always Christ. That's never something that's untrue about you, whether you're baptized or not. You're always Christ, because everything that is proceeds from God, and your matter coming from God. Well, Jesus is the great exemplar of that. In other words, he's the great example. This is how we all are. We look to Jesus and we see that's how we are all made. We are all one with the mystery of divine goodness. So when we're in that state of not knowing, we're realizing Christ. You're realizing your Christ nature, you might say. We're realizing our luminous unity with the divine nothing. Our deep memory, that's who Jesus is, our deep memory. And again, we realize this unity through contemplation. That's the word he eventually gives in books 4 and 5 of the Parousia, to this state of not knowing. He does eventually use the traditional word of contemplation. But it also happens just through love and in daily life, through nature. But he would see, those aspects of our lives and the sacraments, because keep in mind, he's at the court of Charles the Bald, the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Charles the Bald is the grandson of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne was pretty near fanatical about liturgy. He loved liturgy. And one of the first things he did as the Holy Roman Emperor was make sure liturgy was standard in his borders, and that all the liturgical books were up to date, and every priest had a copy. And people who were the ones who helped him the most in that were Benedictine monks. In fact, even though St. Benedict wrote his rule, his monasteries were very modest and small. It was Charlemagne who really spread the rule and mandated, no, every monastery in my borders, you're going to have the rule of Benedict. So Charlemagne is a great standardizer, right? Okay, he makes sure that the liturgy is said the same way in all parts of his land, that the monasteries all follow the same rule. So that affects Eriugena. He would have almost had no choice but to be at liturgy a lot. So he doesn't see liturgy as anywhere removed from this. So in other words, what we do on Sundays, right? What we do when we gather for prayers, Christians, that is all a part of this. But for him, it makes no sense. He doesn't say this, but I mean, you can tell it doesn't make any sense apart from contemplation. And that's, again, pretty standard for most of the mystics, that what we do on Sundays doesn't make any sense unless you are personally on a contemplative journey. And there's just, we could spend a lot of time talking about that. That's a fair point, Eriugena. So Christ is consciousness unleashed. That's our goal. Our goal is not for Eriugena to get to heaven, because preview what I'm going to talk about in just a few moments, that's already been decided. You're going to heaven. That's not the issue for Eriugena. The issue is, are you awake now? Are you going to realize Christ now? So he says, in Jesus Christ's return to the Father, and this is, before I continue the quote, he is remarkable in that he's one of the few medieval thinkers who really takes the resurrection seriously. And it's usually, not that they didn't take it seriously in later years, but it can come across as an afterthought. At least in the Middle Ages, like maybe the high Middle Ages, maybe late 1100s through the 1400s, the Christendom became hyper-focused on the Passion. You know, it's like, you've seen maybe Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ. It's like that times 1,000. And then, oh, by the way, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead. And that's not what they said. I mean, the official liturgies and beliefs are always putting the resurrection center stage. But I wonder if not in everyday piety, it felt like that. And that was maybe the more experiential message people were getting. The resurrection may have felt like an afterthought, not for John Scotus Eriugena. So back to this quote. Is this in your, yes, this is on your sheet on the second page. It's in the middle. In Jesus Christ's return to the Father, which begins through his dissolution in death on the cross and his subsequent resurrection, he elevates the whole human race and therefore the material universe that is contained in its knowing. All humanity, and therefore the cosmos, is restored to paradise. And there that's a whole sentence. That's just one sentence. There in a sentence is his very Christian way of looking at reality. It's not, again, not just the cross, it's Jesus risen. Jesus risen brings all of us back into, that's what starts the return. And it's the guarantee that we're all returning to the Godhead. But notice what he says there. The resurrection first. Eriugena is a universalist through and through. So notice what he says. The resurrection, through his cross and resurrection, Jesus elevates the whole human race. He is very clear about this. It's not just the baptized. He is saying this in the mid-800s, guys. You know, and I actually think they may have been a little bit more open-minded at that point, because I don't know that Islam was the exact force it was, and fear it became, you know, once the Crusades began. But there's a freedom there, and again, it's likely his Irish heritage, where it's just everybody, but it's not just everybody. No, it's not just everybody, right? The Jesus crucified and risen elevates the whole human race, and therefore the material universe. See, the later theology tended to stop with the human, right? And see kind of a separation, because there's that passage in Genesis where God says, I give you dominion over all of creation. And so later theologians, because their minds were leashed, they were attached. They saw that, we're elevated, we're above everyday nature, above the animals and above the trees. We're better than them. So salvation starts and stops with us. Not for Eriugena. It doesn't start and stop with us. It starts with us, but through us, because Remember what he said earlier on in that quote about crushing and destroying everything? The nature shared by man with animals is called flesh with animals. So in other words, we straddle both. We are fully one with the material world. We're fully one with the spiritual world. We're the bridge. We're the bridge. So when we return individually, we actually bring with us the cosmos. It's not just that Jesus saves, it's through Jesus, you save too. I'm hesitating again. You talk about Eriugena, especially this stuff, you're like, is this heresy? It's not, but it's it makes you wonder that the Christianity we were taught, it seems a little punitive. It seems a lot punitive in light of what Eriugena is describing, and unnecessarily restrictive. Why did we start and stop? Why did we just stop with humanity? Why can't it be God? I mean, God created our dogs and our cats and our birds and our bees and our trees and our grass. Why wouldn't that come too back into God? So Eriugena, before he did his great work, before he wrote the Parousia, I mentioned in the first class, he wrote a treatise called On Divine Predestination. And it was a controversy because this monk, Gottschalk, again, wonderful names. Gottschalk said, well, based on the Bible and based on my reading of the Bible, it seems like God is only going to save a certain number of people and everybody else is going to go to hell. And I know I'm going to heaven because I'm a monk. And everybody, I can tell there's definitely some few who are going to be saved, and God predestined some to hell. There's a split. Some are predestined to heaven. Some are predestined to hell. So it's not just starting and stopping with humanity. It's only a small section of humanity. What is it, guys? What is it that makes us want to exclude? It's this it almost feels like innate human tendency. It's only my group and not your group, right? Well, Gottschalk does that, his own version of scapegoating, right? And the bishops at that time were understandably upset. No, this can't be. We have to have someone take him on. This cannot be out there. It's almost like Fox News and MSNBC already in the 800s. And no, we can't have that. And so Hincmar, the bishop, says, we got to get someone to respond. Let's get Eriugena. And he thought Eriugena, was a good MSNBC correspondent. It turned out it was like Bernie Sanders. It was just, he lobbed the whole bomb in there and said, no, it's not about heaven or hell at all. Everybody's going to heaven. I'm not sure there is a hell, basically, Eriugena said. And Hincmar, it's like, no, don't say that. Let me read, this is from Christopher Bamford. And if you just want to get one book on Eriugena, I'll recommend a few, but his is a really good one. It's called The Voice of the Eagle. He gives a really good, readable introduction to Eriugena, and then he gives his own translation of a work of his called The Homily on the Prologue of John, which is a very good, and again, a very readable work by Eriugena. You remember last week I brought the Parousia, and I highly discouraged you from reading it. It's so long. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages, and it is dense. But his homily is very good. The Parousia is very good too. It's just dense. But anyway, this is Christopher Bamford talking about Eriugena's work on divine predestination, which Hincmar, the bishop, asked him to write. So Bamford says, God, the only reality, who is good by definition, and for whom it is not one thing to be and another to will, but for whom being and willing are the same, there can be only a single predestination to eternal salvation. So that was the key, and that was the clear reprimand Eriugena was lobbing towards Gottschalk. No, there's only one destination. Everyone's going to get saved. And that he's got scriptural, pretty good evidence for. I think it's the first letter of Timothy, God wills the salvation of all. But even this for Eriugena was only a manner of speaking, for predestination invokes time, and double predestination duality. neither of which are realities for God. For God, therefore, suffering, sin, and evil do not exist, and so cannot be predestined. God knows only what is real. Let me read that again. That's a good line. And I take that in several ways. God knows only what is real. God does not know what occurs as a result of ignorance. On the human plane, the law of cause and effect obtains. Indeed, it is a rule. As sin arises from the individual will, so does punishment. For Eriugena, neither sin nor punishment comes from God, only from the sinner, whose sin will continue to punish itself until the end of time, when all nature will be restored. The essential nature of the sinner, however, is not involved in this, since every nature in its essence is divine. Now, he doesn't say there's no hell. And he does, in fact, say everybody will eventually return, everything and everybody will return to the Godhead, to the nothing. But he resolves this tension that we experience here of, there are clearly some people who are sinners who, we can just stay with the absolutes, Stalin, a Hitler, a Pol Pot, right? Those people cannot be in God's presence. And Eriugena would say, well, guess what? Their essential nature, just like all of us, is divine. They don't know that. They're in severe psychotic ignorance of that. But that's their essential nature. Everything comes back to God. This is not a statement for Eriugena about the individual. It's a statement about God. This is who God is. God brings everyone back. Did you notice that we began that with, by God, the definition of God is to be good. If God is good, God condemns nobody to heaven, to hell, or to punishment. If God is good, there's just no punishment in God. There's no punishment in God. So Eriugena says, yeah, the punishment all comes from within. And he says that actually carries over into heaven. That, someone who's tortured here on earth because they're too greedy, let's take a Bernie Madoff, for instance. Well, he's going to be tortured in the afterlife because his greed is going to stay with him, according to Eriugena. That's how he kind of resolves that tension. It's weird because when we're here, it's almost like Eriugena is at pains to abolish all hierarchies. But then when we get to heaven, there's still kind of a hierarchy. So he's not perfect. We can do a little criticism of Eriugena too, even though he says, basically, everybody's going to heaven. Because I have a problem with that. I don't think it would be true to God's nature to have hierarchies in heaven. That, in other words, maybe those of us who are gathered here and on Zoom, we're the ones who really know God. And then, there's the people who maybe, shop at Trader Joe's or don't go to church. They don't really know God that well. No, they're second class, right? And then there's third class and maybe like 120th class behind us, right? There's a Hitler, there's a Stalin, right? But I don't think that's true to God's nature. And again, Eriugena is very clear. God is goodness. God is good. Finally, this is still Christopher Bamford. Finally, since the universe is one, could there be any place of perpetual punishment? No, because Eriugena doesn't tackle this even in a scriptural way. He just says, God is one and simple. There is no place outside of God. There can be no literal hell because there's no place outside of God. The only hell is that your attachments will continue to kind of torture you. But Bamford says, until the end of time, which is different. So there's a little out there because when we return to God, we're going out of time. That is the end of time. So maybe Eriugena is a lot more positive than I'm giving him credit for. Because listen, this is the last quote on your sheet here, which is just beautiful. It's just beautiful. In fact, I invite you just to close your eyes and listen, because it's so beautiful. We will merge with God completely, as lights blend into the one light, as voices blend in the choir, as a droplet of water merges with the stream. God shall be all in all, and every creature shall be overshadowed, that is, converted to God, as the stars when the sun arises. That's poetry. And despite the denseness of the Paraphusion, he often slips into more poetic voice throughout the text. But that's pretty remarkable. So there's this tension in Eriugena because it's still kind of church teaching. No, there's got to be punishment because we commit crimes on earth, because we sin. And he's feeling a little pressure from Hinkmar, right? But then he ends with that. He ends with, no, everything, not everyone, everything will merge with God, that God will be all in all. And that's 1 Corinthians chapter 15, right? God is all in all. Like that great passage where Paul says, Jesus talking about the resurrection, Jesus at the end of time will hand everything over to God, and then God will be all in all. What that does mean, no one is excluded. So there's just this really strong universalist streak in Eriugena. And I wonder if he's not sometimes wrestling over it within himself, because I bet we could have some very legitimate questions. If everyone's saved, what the hell am I doing here? Why am I here? Why do I come to church then? Why don't I out living the good life? And he might reply, and I think any good mystic would, living the good life, so to speak, living just drinking, drugs, sex, rock and roll, whatever, or just binging Netflix, it's not going to really make you happy. Maybe Netflix, I don't know. But a life, attached to those things is not going to make you happy. So after the end of this world, Eriugena says, every nature will seem to be only God, while preserving the integrity of its nature. Now, again, he's a master of paradox, okay? So at the end, everything is revealed to be divine, and yet you're still you, I'm still me, because he says it here, while preserving the integrity of its nature. So I read that as you'll be most fully yourself, most authentically, fully, totally in possession of who you are when you are God. Then there's that great paradox. It's just the more surrendered you are, the freer you are. This is the freedom of Jesus crucified. This is the freedom that comes from the resurrection, according to Eriugena. My theology teacher used to say, if you go home to your hometown and you have a neighbor who's lived next door to your home for decades upon decades, and you see them and you go up to this neighbor and you say, wow, you haven't changed in all these years. He'd say, there's something wrong with that guy. He needs to change, It's you're not fully, he would say, we're not all there yet. I'm not all there. Meaning we're not finished, right? Well, when this happens, when we all share fully in the resurrection or return to the Godhead fully, then we are ourselves totally. Then we are finished, so to speak. So it's you can think of the world as unfinished. And there is a lot of resonance there with evolution, right? Evolution it just seems like, this world is still changing and growing and evolving into something we don't know. It's not finished yet. That wholly coheres with what Eriugena is saying here. He teaches the conscious merging of all beings into God. No souls, including, and he even says this, the souls of animals and the souls of demons. No being, no soul will be left out of this grand return. No one would be damned to suffer forever in hell. And I hate the idea of hell, frankly. It's in the doctrine personally, because it doesn't cohere with God's goodness. How could there be eternal punishment? And the crime seems to far outweigh the punishment seems to far outweigh the crime. We're living finite lives. We're even committing finite sins, and we're going to receive an infinite punishment. Like, that doesn't seem fair at all. And Eriugena just sidesteps the whole issue. No. Because essentia omnium, God is the essence of everything. Everything goes back to God. Everything. And this is from his homily on the prologue to John. In case you are tempted to say that it is impossible that mortals should become immortals, that corruptible beings should become free of corruption, that simple human beings should become children of God, that temporal creatures should possess eternity, accept the argument that faith prepares for what you doubt. Why is it astonishing that a human being who believes in the Son of God should become a son of God? For this very, very purpose, indeed, the Word descended into flesh, that in him the flesh, the human being, might ascend, that through him who was the only begotten Son by nature, might many become sons by adoption. Alone he came down, but with many he goes up. He from whom God made himself a human being makes gods from human beings. That's beautiful at the end there. Let me read that again. He who from God made himself a human being makes gods from human beings. The point is that we all become gods. The point is that we all, in other words, share in the divine nature. And in books 4 and 5 of the Paraphusion, he talks about that as theosis, divinization, deification. Okay, so that is his whole program. But just so you know, I'm not lying to you. Here is Deirdre Carabine, who is a great Irish scholar, and she is talking about this universal return. Okay, and then I'll send you into groups. There are numerous accounts of the return in the Paraphusion, one of which describes the general return of sensible creation and takes place in 5 stages. And here's where you'll find the resurrection is key. Okay, the body is dissolved back into the 4 elements of the world. So the return begins when we die. The big return begins when we die. We start the return here on earth when we enter into this state of unknowing, but it kind of supercharges when we die. And when we die, Eriugena says the body is dissolved back and basically into the earth. Well, that's right on target so far. At the resurrection, each will receive its own body back from the elements. The return of the body into spirit. You have to know that the Middle Ages, Greek philosophy, they wanted nothing to do with the body. So that he is including the body at all is a huge win. That he's elevating the body is just mind-blowing. The return of the spirit into the primordial causes, the whole of nature with the causes return into God, then there will be only God. There's these different levels, right? We die, we go back into the earth, then after death, at the resurrection, the general resurrection, we all are reunited with our bodies, and then our bodies go into our spirits, and our spirits go into the primordial causes, which are these ways that God creates the world. Basically, they're very Platonic. And then everything just goes back into God. Okay, so it's almost like a big vacuum cleaner. God just sucks everything back up. Another account of return retraces the process of division back to unity. So creation for Eriugena is when everything kind of divides up. Everything comes out of God, and there's the Big Bang, and there's just everything goes from oneness to plurality. And the return is when all those various plural things sink back into oneness, yet they remain plural. So again, we remain ourselves and become most fully ourselves. First, created nature is divided from what is not created. Created nature is divided into sensible and intelligible. All these different divisions happen. But one of the most interesting aspects of Eriugena's thought in relation to the return is that he is not elitist about who will make the return. For all created things must return to their source. Sinners and saints alike shall be converted into spirit. A celestial angelic body will be restored to the just and the unjust after the resurrection. It's everyone. It's just everyone. Again, this is remarkable because it just seems like after Jesus, for the most part, the church has just been closing doors on who was getting into heaven. And I don't include, I say that about all the churches. You know, all the churches have said at one point or another said, these people are excluded, right? And Eriugena doesn't make any distinction there. No one is excluded. And that's where you can bring up your questions about justice and about, well, what do we do with a Hitler? You know, but I often wonder when we bring up those questions, in a sense, why are you ruining a good thing? We're all going back. And the rule is not human justice. The rule is divine justice. And at least for Eriugena, God's goodness overrules justice, at least as we understand. Okay, so I don't know how that works, but this is what Eriugena says. So let me give you a good 15, 20 minutes to talk amongst yourselves, and maybe we can have some generous time for some Q&A after that, okay? Why don't you take 15 minutes? That way we have a good 20 minutes for Q&A. And if you find if you find that you're wrapping up earlier, then we'll just come back and talk amongst ourselves, okay? So your questions are basically, how's this hitting you? What questions do you have? What does the return look like in your own life? How is that return journey going? In other words, how are you living a contemplative life? How are you finding your consciousness is bound or trapped? How are you trying to free your consciousness? And then what do you think about this whole business of everyone's going to heaven? And what do you think about hell? We spent a lot of time talking about that. All right, go ahead. Now, I think you can offer a legitimate criticism of Eriugena based on the Bible that, well, wait a minute, if God is all love, you know, I don't think that even in heaven, God would allow someone to be tortured by their attachments. That seems kind of contrary to heaven.
Right. Who's going to show up in heaven is the essence,
Right.
the goodness part.
And that's why I think when Bamford says that at the end of time, we'll all go back into God. And it's like, well, then at the end of time, we're leaving behind the condition that would make such behaviors possible. You know, it's just all going back into God. And see, Eriugena, and this is also something we might consider, because it seems like most epochs and eras of human history have a problem with paradox. And paradox is not, you know, it's not just simple two different things are true at the same time all the time. True paradox works with reason and then goes beyond reason. So in other words, it's not consistent with God's love, you know, for Eriugena, and not only him, but also others. Julian of Norwich comes to mind. It's not consistent with God's love that there be an eternal hell. And really, if you look at the scriptures,
Other thinking,
it's all part of the other thinking.
you know,
Right.
take the other.
Right. Almost God is scapegoating the people who were bold enough to say, or brazen enough to say, I don't believe in you, God. You know, there is reason that sees, okay, God, it's not consistent with God's love that there be an eternal punishment. But then there's the paradox that God can be just and merciful and everyone's going to go to heaven. And I don't know how that's going to work when, you know, Hitler meets the people who were in the concentration camps. You know, I don't know how that's going to work. I don't know how, I don't know. Yeah.
I think it's dissolved at that.
Yeah. Well, at the same time, there's this clear understanding that even when we're all back in the Godhead fully, we'll still be ourselves. So there must be a way in which we're all fully, authentically ourselves. And like I said before, those conditions that caused and clouded, that caused sin and suffering and clouded our essential goodness, those must be what dissolves. Yeah, I don't know.
When he starts
I don't know.
talking emptiness,
Mhm.
Emptiness is we are empty of self-existence.
There you go.
There's no such thing. Everything.
That's a
is
good point.
interdependent
Yeah.
With everything else.
So he's saying that, because we don't have the mic with us, that when Eriugena is talking about nothingness and emptiness, that we're empty of self. That self that did all those things is gone. And in it, that self is dead and gone. Right. The attachment is dead and gone. The attachment that caused, and that's maybe more precisely the point, even though we like to think, and Bamford and Eriugena are talking about it in terms of cause and effect in this world. That's not really how the spiritual world always works. It doesn't work by our laws of cause and effect. So yes, to take an extreme example, Hitler started World War II, right? But that cause and effect is not the same in the next world. Now, does that, we're very keyed into consequences and responsibility and holding people accountable, right? And that's a good thing of this world, to hold, he did start World War II. That is true. And yet, this is where the paradox comes in. The paradox comes in now, how will that person, his essential goodness, will be returned to the divine nothingness. God somehow makes that happen. And for Eriugena, and I don't know why he doesn't lean more into this. I think a good mystic should, and probably does experientially, that God is pure love. Just lean more and more into that. Eckhart does. And he's clear. I think he was influenced by Eriugena. He says, no, God is just love without why. There is no why to God. God just loves. That's who God is, right?
So we're returning to the Godhead as we left.
Well, maybe. Well, yes, we're good. Yes, and that we emerge from the Godhead good and we return good, and yet we can't say that we aren't changed somehow, right? There's again, we're brushing up against paradox. How you will. There was a time when LJ was not, right? And then now there will be my essential goodness is now going to return at the end of time to the primordial nothingness, and yet LJ is going to be there too. And there's again the paradox. I am going to be empty of self. That's a weird statement to say, because the I is the self. Yet it's still true. I will be empty of self, and it will only be God. And yet I will be fully me. Holding those both together is that there's good tension there. Yeah. And that's what I am now anyway. Right. It's not Eriugena, but Eckhart Tolle says something I think that is worth adding to this conversation. He says, all mistakes lead to the awakening. All mistakes will contribute to your personal awakening. All mistakes will eventually contribute to the whole of humanity awakening. And there's something to that. There's something very Christian about that, frankly, that God will use our sins and mistakes. And who speaks so beautifully on this, and who was another universalist, right, is Julian of Norwich. She's just, God uses your pain and your sin and that's what God will turn that into blessing and honor and glory for you. And you think, my goodness, that's better than I just get into heaven. That's better than a free ticket into heaven. God is going to glorify you and ennoble you by means of the things that you think are shameful. Yeah. Right. And yet God turned that around too. It's like God's good job description that turns everything bad that we give God all of our bad, turns to good, right? It's a really good, he's a good recycler, God. So I'm glad it's not really a question for us, I don't think, because we want to make it that, because we want to assert some control here over who goes into heaven and hell.
Yeah, I think that's a major human passion.
We love God. We love, if you read medieval poetry and prose, you probably know someone who put people in hell. In fact, your understanding of hell is probably most affected by this person and most formed by this person. And it's not a writer from the Bible, it's Dante. Dante is probably the one who has formed our imaginations regarding hell the most. And he felt no shame in naming people who said, this Pope is on the 6th level of hell. Machiavelli, he's right there on the 5th level of hell. And whatever, that wasn't Machiavelli. It was one of the big families in Italy, powerful families. Maybe he's one of those families, right? He was happy to name names. And, it's interesting. He was around the same time as Eckhart. And there's, again, two different takes on reality. And yet even Dante will call God the love that moves the sun and the stars. And it's, okay, you got it. You just have to integrate that into the rest of your vision of reality. Eriugena comes pretty close to doing that, and to seeing all of reality in that light as totally one. Because that when we talk about love, we're not talking about just kindness or a sunny disposition or sentimentality or romance. We're talking about, at least for Eriugena, he's talking about oneness. And he does not see, and maybe this is where he parts ways with a number of contemporary to his time and later theologians. He does not see any opposition at all in reality. He doesn't see any opposition between being and nature, between reality with a capital R and our personal realities. Eriugena doesn't see any conflict or opposition between consciousness and existence. He just sees everything as whole. And you have to think, he likely didn't learn that in France. He learned that in Ireland from some really pretty good monks in Ireland who were probably more attuned to God in nature.
Do you know what monastery?
We have no idea where he would have studied and really that he even studied in Ireland is a supposition. We're not entirely sure. We don't know much about him just beyond the time he's writing, when he's at the court of Charles the Bald. And again, we're not even really 100% sure he was a layperson, he was a monk, he was a priest. There's nothing that says he was a monk or a priest, and that likely would have survived.
Yeah.
So we have this weird, and it is weird. He was likely a lay theologian in the 800s, which is just, we haven't had lay theologians until like the last 100 years.
Well, literate lay.
Yeah, it's just kind of remarkable. But again, he's a Celtic sage, so he's probably he makes it kind of furthers the reputation of Ireland at this time from around 300 to 900 that it was just an island full of saints and sages, and it seems like it wasn't just the monks and the priests; it was pretty much everybody. So, any other comments or questions from your conversation, or anything at all I said, or anything from the past two sessions, if you weren't here? Oh, you're most welcome. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. The silence tends to do that. Yeah. It enriches. First of all, because I stopped speaking. And second of all, because it's to quote Thomas Keating, I love this line. silence is God's first language. You think that is very resonant with Eriugena. If everything emerges from, he uses various terms, the divine darkness, the divine silence, the divine nothingness, then yeah, why wouldn't? That's God's way of communicating, silence. Yes, yes. Silence is God's first language, but everything else is a bad translation. Yes. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, Keating had I don't know if any of you met Keating. I met him a few times and he had a twinkle in his eye. It's a story about him as he was approaching his death. A visitor came by to see him, said, "Father Thomas, how are you?" And Thomas said, "I'm great." And he smiled big. "I'm dying." And I didn't plan that, but that is a good sign of the return. I mean, Keating was on his way back to the Godhead, right? That's the return. And you have to think, if you're living with consciousness unleashed, fear dissolves, because fear is really composed of our senses only grasping the realities that we see in front of us, and deducing from that, seeing that things don't last forever, and so therefore I don't last forever. And then that fear seizes the ego of what happens. I'm just going to dissolve and become absolutely omni no nihil, absolutely nothing. And we know now, if we just still and quiet our minds, well, we realize that's what lasts forever. That's what returns to the Godhead, the nothing, the divine goodness, the source. That's a word he uses too, actually, source. Yeah, for the ultimate God, you could say. So yeah, we're all dying, and rejoice. Is maybe what Eriugena would say. Or I'm just going to quote this one last time. Let me see if I can find it really quick. Just to remind you that he was also a humorist. I don't know if you remember from our first session. Hincmar, was the guy who asked him to write that book on divine predestination. Hincmar did not like that book. And they must have had a severe falling out because, bishops, not all the time, but they at least in the Middle Ages, they tended to get greedy. So let me end with this just lovely play, which ties in death too, by the way. And it's Eriugena talking about Hincmar, Bishop Hincmar, upon his death. "Here lies Hincmar, crook, but savage greed aside, he did one truly noble thing. He died." All right, guys. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. Enjoy your night. Bye-bye.